Imagine a proposal sitting on a desk in the White House right now that argues the only conceivable way to achieve permanent global stability is to literally erase 60% of Turkey.
Right.
And, half of Iraq, half of Syria, and 40% of Iran. Just off the map entirely.
Yeah, it's wild.
Like, we are not talking about moving a border fence a few miles to accommodate a river here. We are looking at the blueprint for the largest, most aggressive geopolitical demolition in modern history.
It really is a staggering proposition. I mean, we are dealing with documents today that don't just suggest, minor policy tweaks or foreign aid adjustments.
Right, like a new trade deal or whatever.
Exactly. They demand the total structural dismantling of 4 internationally recognized sovereign nations to create this massive unified state of Kurdistan.
So today, our exploration is stepping away from our usual broad synthesis of a dozen different articles or new book releases. We are zeroing in on 2 highly specific, explosive geopolitical texts. One of these is a high-level policy memorandum directed at the United States White House Advisory Team, and it's authored by Smik Ali, a representative of the United Regions of Kurdistan.
Right.
And the core argument here is that the Middle East is fundamentally architecturally broken, and the only cure is taking a sledgehammer to the borders. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah, but before we look at the logistics of dismantling 4 major powers, we have to be absolutely clear with you, the listener, about our parameters for this deep dive today.
Yes, the hazard suits.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The material we're dissecting is profoundly politically charged. I mean, it touches on the deepest nerves of national sovereignty, historical trauma, and ongoing, highly sensitive regional conflicts.
It's extremely sensitive.
So neither of us is taking a side today. We are not endorsing this proposal. We are not validating the specific historical claims made by the author, nor are we, defending the governments of Iran, Turkey, Iraq, or Syria.
Right. We are essentially putting on those hazard suits, walking into a geopolitical laboratory, and observing a highly volatile chemical reaction. We're reading the label on the beaker to understand what the chemicals are doing, but we are definitely not drinking them.
Right. No drinking the chemicals. Our only goal is to act as your objective guides through the architecture of this argument. We want to convey the ideas, the internal logic, and the frameworks exactly as they're presented in the source texts.
Completely without political bias.
Exactly. We are analyzing a massive, world-altering pitch, and we just need to understand how that pitch is constructed.
So to understand the pitch, we have to start with how these documents diagnose the disease, right? Like when we turn on the news and see the endless cycle of instability in the Middle East.
The insurgencies, the proxy wars.
Yeah, the economic collapses. We tend to view those as like modern political failures. We blame a specific prime minister or a religious sect or, I don't know, a failed trade agreement.
By the symptoms.
But the author of this memo argues that we are entirely missing the point. They claim the instability is a structural flaw stemming directly from the end of World War I. They call it the original sin of the map.
The original sin, yeah. Because the documents point a very specific finger at the geopolitical order established by the victorious European powers after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. They explicitly name agreements, like the Sykes-Picot Agreement and the Treaty of Lausanne. And the author doesn't just say these agreements were, flawed or short-sighted or clumsily executed.
They go much further than that.
They do. They frame the borders drawn by these treaties as factually false and morally unjust.
Which, those are incredibly heavy accusations for a diplomatic memo. Claiming a map is false feels like an epistemological argument. It's like looking at a drawing of an apple, but the caption underneath insists it's an orange.
That's exactly how they frame it.
The text argues that the modern map of the Middle East completely ignores the ancient historical and demographic realities of the region, like the reality on the ground versus the ink on the paper.
Right. They draw a hard line between artificial geography and natural geography. The authors argue that underneath the ink lines of modern Iraq or Syria or Turkey, there is a natural geography of where distinct peoples, cultures, and language groups have lived for literally thousands of years.
Yeah.
And in 1916, when British and French diplomats Mark Sykes and François-Georges Picot sat in rooms in Europe with grease pencils and rulers, they were not trying to reflect that natural reality at all.
Not even a little bit.
No. The text states they drew these lines purely for the narrow, temporary interests of the winning allies.
And those narrow interests were entirely imperial.
Right.
They were dividing up the oil fields in Mosul, they were securing shipping lanes to India, and making sure rival European empires didn't get too much leverage.
Exactly, playing a giant game of Risk.
Yeah, they were looking at the land as a resource grid, completely ignoring the millions of people actually living on the sand or, up in the mountains.
Which leads directly to the author's claim that the map is unjust. Because these lines were drawn for imperial resource management, the victors actively dismantled pre-existing functional social structures.
They broke apart communities.
Right, they took a cohesive historical communities and either trapped them within arbitrary new borders alongside rival groups, or they sliced a single cohesive community into pieces and distributed them across multiple new countries.
With the Kurds being the ultimate example of that slicing.
The primary example, the Treaty of Sèvres in 1920 actually promised the Kurds a state, but just 3 years later, the Treaty of Lausanne completely erased that promise.
Striped it out.
Wiped it out entirely to appease the newly formed Republic of Turkey. So the Kurds were suddenly partitioned across Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And the result of this process, the text argues, is that these newly minted states lacked any organic political legitimacy.
Right.
They weren't formed from the ground up by the people who lived there. They were imposed from the top down as, administrative zones for foreign powers.
If I can introduce an analogy here, I think it captures the mechanics of what the text is arguing perfectly.
Yeah, go for it.
Imagine building a massive, incredibly expensive house. If you build that house directly on top of an active tectonic fault line, the house is going to crack.
Inevitably.
Right. It doesn't matter how beautiful the architecture is. It doesn't matter if you install state-of-the-art security or if you change the landlord every 4 years. The ground beneath the structure is fundamentally shifting. The text is saying the entire Middle East is a neighborhood built on a geopolitical fault line.
And no amount of fresh paint is going to stop the foundation from splitting.
Exactly. But I imagine someone listening right now is thinking, well, aren't there plenty of extremely diverse countries with totally arbitrary borders that manage to function perfectly well?
Sure.
Look at the borders in North America, or parts of Africa, or even Indonesia. Many nations are a hodgepodge of different ethnic groups drawn together by colonial history. So what makes these specific lines in the Middle East uniquely toxic, according to the author?
That is a crucial distinction to make. And the document addresses this by pointing to the sheer scale of the demographic mismatch, combined with the inherently violent nature of the enforcement required to maintain it.
Okay, unpack that a bit.
Well, it's one thing to have a diverse nation where various groups eventually negotiate a shared civic identity over time, right?
Yeah.
But the text argues that these specific post-World War I borders forced a dynamic where the state's very existence relies on the active, continuous, and often brutal suppression of its own demographics.
Because the state doesn't reflect the people.
Precisely. Because these administrative zones were designed for foreign control, when the British and French eventually left, the local governments that took over inherited a ticking time bomb.
They were set up to fail.
Yeah, they had to spend massive amounts of their own capital, both political and financial, just to keep the artificial borders from ripping apart. Lacking organic legitimacy among a huge percentage of their population, these governments had to manufacture compliance through sheer force.
Which means the state is fighting a perpetual, never-ending war against its own foundation. It has to view its own citizens as a national security threat.
Right, and that structural tension never goes away. It just oscillates. Sometimes it's a simmering resentment, sometimes it's political imprisonment, and sometimes it erupts into outright military conflict and insurgency. But the underlying friction is a constant hum.
So if the fundamental diagnosis is that the map itself is a factual lie and a moral injustice, the author's solution is not to, ask for better human rights within the current system.
No, not at all.
They aren't asking to move a border checkpoint a few miles. The proposed cure is staggering geographical demolition. And the numbers they present in this memo are almost impossible to wrap your head around at first glance.
They really are. The territorial claims in the document are undeniably the most jaw-dropping aspect of the entire proposal. The text doesn't deal in vague requests for cultural autonomy or decentralized federalism.
It's way past that.
Way past. It lays out highly specific, maximalist territorial claims that demand the dismemberment of internationally recognized powers.
When I first read these figures, I honestly had to stop and reread the paragraph because my brain just sort of rejected the scale of it.
Yeah, it's hard to process.
Here are the explicit claims made by the text. Iran is nearly 40% Kurdistan, Turkey is 60% Kurdistan, Iraq is 50% Kurdistan, and Syria is 50% Kurdistan.
We need to really visualize this for you, the listener, because the sheer scale is difficult to process using standard geopolitical metrics. Let's take Iran first. 40% of Iran.
That's huge.
We are not talking about carving out a small remote province in the mountains. Iran is a massive, incredibly proud nation with a deep imperial history stretching back millennia. Taking away 40% means essentially amputating the entire western flank of the country.
Wow.
You are sweeping down from the Turkish and Armenian borders, capturing the entirety of the massive Zagros mountain range and stretching all the way down the border with Iraq.
You are taking away millions of citizens, vast amounts of strategic military depth, and a huge chunk of their natural defensive geography. And then you look at Turkey. The text claims 60% of Turkey is actually Kurdistan.
Right.
60%. That is the majority of the Turkish landmass.
To visualize 60% of Turkey disappearing, you have to imagine pushing the eastern border incredibly far west, almost to the center of the Anatolian Plateau. You are stripping Turkey of its vast, rugged eastern interior.
Like major cities.
Major cities, yeah. Places like Diyarbakir, Van, Erzurum. You are pushing the line so far that Turkey essentially ceases to be a sprawling transcontinental Middle Eastern power. It is reduced to a European coastal rump state bordering the Aegean and the Black Sea.
It would be fundamentally unrecognizable from the Turkey that exists on the global stage today.
Totally unrecognizable.
Like if you live in the United States, this is the equivalent of a document landing on the president's desk claiming that everything west of the Mississippi River is fundamentally illegitimate, historically stolen, and needs to be legally handed over to a new sovereign entity immediately.
That's a great comparison.
The psychological shock to the national identity of Turkey or Iran would be immeasurable.
And then we look at Iraq and Syria, where the claim is exactly 50%, half of each country. And geographically, the northern halves of Iraq and Syria, which is the territory in question, are not just empty expanses of desert. That is where the vital resources are concentrated.
Right. In Iraq, that northern half includes massive, century-old oil reserves around places like Kirkuk. It includes the most fertile agricultural heartlands. Crucially, it includes the headwaters of both the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Which means this newly unified state of Kurdistan would completely control the water supply for whatever desert territories remain of Arab Iraq and Syria downstream.
This is a zero-sum game. If you poof 60% of Turkey or 50% of Iraq out of existence, taking their primary water sources and their oil revenues, do those original countries even survive the amputation?
It's a real question.
Like, can a nation lose half its territory and its core economic engines and still function as a state?
The author of the text is brutally honest about this reality. They do not shy away from the consequences. They use the word dismantling.
They actually say dismantling.
Yes. They are not asking for peaceful coexistence within the current framework of the United Nations map. They are stating, unequivocally, that the current framework must be destroyed for the natural reality to be restored.
This completely flips the script on how these conflicts are usually covered in the news. Whenever we hear about Kurdish groups or other regional factions fighting, the media uses a very specific vocabulary.
Yeah, the traditional geopolitical discourse relies heavily on the word separatists. When a group fights for independence, the implicit assumption baked into international law is that the existing state, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, is the legitimate default entity.
Right.
The separatists are framed as rebels trying to break a piece off of a sovereign whole.
But the author completely inverts that narrative here.
It is a total paradigm shift.
Okay.
Under the logic of this text, this is not a narrative of separatism. It is a narrative of reclamation. The author is arguing that these modern states are actively occupying Kurdistan.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Turkey isn't defending its eastern border against insurgents. Turkey is an occupying force in western Kurdistan. Iran isn't managing a rebellious western province. Iran is occupying eastern Kurdistan.
So it reframes the established UN-recognized nations as the primary aggressors simply by virtue of existing within their current borders. It's an incredible mental exercise. Just imagine a map of the Middle East with this new, massive, unified Kurdistan dropped right in the center. It would be larger than France.
Easily.
It would stretch from the Mediterranean Sea in the west, deep into the Iranian plateau in the east. It would instantly become a regional superpower sitting on vast energy resources, controlling the major waterways, and serving as the geographic bridge between Europe and Asia.
But this vision immediately collides with a massive, glaring logistical and demographic reality on the ground. Over the last century, these borders haven't just been lines on paper. The governments of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria have actively engaged in massive demographic engineering.
Yeah, they've moved people.
They have moved entire populations. They have displaced Kurds and settled Arabs, Turks, and Persians into these historically Kurdish areas to solidify their control.
Right. I mean, you think of Saddam Hussein's Arabization campaigns in northern Iraq, specifically around the oil fields of Kirkuk. He systematically forced Kurdish families out and moved Arab families in. So today, if you look at a city like Kirkuk or certain cities in eastern Turkey, they might have massive Arab or Turkish majorities. You can't just draw a new border and say, this is Kurdistan now, without addressing the millions of non-Kurds who have lived there for generations.
And this is where the proposal introduces a highly specific, legally grounded mechanism to address that exact friction. The document does not advocate for reverse ethnic cleansing or forced deportations.
Which is what you usually see in these kinds of territorial disputes.
Right, but instead it proposes a mandate for UN-supervised referendums in these highly contested areas.
Okay, walk me through how that actually works, because running an election in a heavily militarized, ethnically divided city sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It is, but the text explicitly acknowledges the areas that are currently majority Persian, Turkish, or Arab due to the systemic displacement of Kurds over the last century. Their proposed solution is to bring in the international community, specifically the United Nations, to supervise binding referendums.
Okay.
But the crucial element here is what the populations are voting on.
They aren't just voting on a flag.
Yeah, exactly. Before any vote takes place, the proposal dictates that the constitution of this new United Regions of Kurdistan must be formally presented to these diverse populations.
Ah, so they see the rules first.
Yes. This constitution is pitched as a hyper-modern, inclusive legal framework that explicitly guarantees fundamental human rights, civil liberties, and cultural freedoms for all residents, regardless of whether they are Arab, Turk, Persian, or Kurd.
So the pitch to the Arab family living in Kirkuk is, we know you were moved here by a previous regime, but if you vote to join this new state, your rights, your language, and your property will be constitutionally protected by a framework that is infinitely more democratic than the government currently ruling you.
That is the precise argument. The author is trying to demonstrate to the international community that this new state will not simply replicate the oppressive tactics of the nations it is replacing. And to prove this, the text includes a formal commitment to abide by the binding results of these UN-supervised referendums. If a historically Kurdish region that was Arabized ultimately votes in a free and fair UN election to remain part of Iraq or Syria, the new Kurdish state commits to respecting that democratic outcome.
That is a massive concession and a very savvy diplomatic move.
It really is.
It shifts the entire project from a violent, irredentist land grab into a process of democratic self-determination governed by international law. It gives the superpower nations reading this memo a legal and moral off-ramp to actually support the project.
It does. But even with the promise of democratic referendums, we are still talking about dismantling the core territory of 4 major nations.
Yeah, you can't sugarcoat that.
Right. And the obvious pushback from the international community, from Washington, London, or Paris, would be, this is too chaotic. The map is flawed, yes, but erasing countries will trigger a massive regional war. Let's just fix these countries from the inside.
Let's promote democracy, let's change the leadership, let's fund civil society programs, and improve human rights.
Exactly.
Why tear down the house when you can just elect a better landlord?
Precisely. And that line of thinking, the deeply entrenched Western belief that we can fix the house without moving it off the fault line, brings us directly to the text's brutal, categorical dismissal of internal reform and regime change.
The author pulls absolutely no punches here. They claim, and I'm quoting directly from the text here, changing regimes does not solve the fundamental problem in any way.
In any way.
That is a total rejection of the last 70 years of Western foreign policy in the Middle East.
Think of the billions, probably trillions of dollars, the military interventions, the diplomatic summits, the endless NGO programs, all dedicated to democratizing or reforming these specific countries.
Decades of work.
And the text argues that all of this effort, all of the blood and treasure spent trying to install better leaders or write better local laws, is utterly mathematically useless.
But why? Like, why does the text insist that a genuinely good, democratically elected leader cannot fix a bad map? If you get someone in power in Ankara or Tehran who genuinely respects human rights, shouldn't the borders stop mattering as much?
Because the text introduces a concept that I find incredibly compelling. They call it the mental and beliefs of the systems. We can think of this as structural psychology.
Structural psychology. Okay.
The argument is that the physical geometry of the state actually dictates the behavior of its leader. The borders themselves, by their very artificial nature, mandate tyranny.
Okay, let's slow down and really dissect that. How does a line drawn in the sand 100 years ago force a modern leader to become a tyrant?
Let's put ourselves in a hypothetical scenario. Let's say you are elected president of one of these 4 countries. You are a true reformer. You genuinely want peace. You believe deeply in freedom of speech. And you want your diverse country to prosper.
Sounds great so far.
But you are governing a country where, according to this text, up to 60% of your land, historically and demographically, belongs to a completely different, highly cohesive nation that does not want to be part of your state.
They have their own language, their own history, and they want their own sovereignty.
Yes. So the moment you act on your democratic principles, the moment you allow true freedom of the press, the moment you allow open political assembly and free elections, that massive demographic group will inevitably use those democratic freedoms to organize.
Right.
They will vote to secede, or they will demand a level of autonomy that effectively fractures your state into pieces.
So your own democratic reforms will be the weapon used to destroy the country you were elected to lead.
Exactly. So as the leader, you're instantly faced with a binary choice dictated entirely by the map. You either sit back and watch the nation disintegrate on your watch, or you abandon your democratic principles and use violent authoritarian suppression to hold the artificial borders together.
So the argument is that even if you elect a perfectly peaceful, democratic leader, the map itself will inevitably corrupt them.
The map demands an oppressor to maintain it. The structural imperative of any state is self-preservation. If the state's borders are entirely artificial and rejected by half the population, self-preservation requires oppression.
It's unavoidable.
It does not matter if the leader is a monarch, a military general, a secular president, or a religious cleric. The system will force them to build a secret police force. It will force them to militarize the eastern provinces.
I love thinking about this in terms of computer engineering. It's like a software versus hardware analogy. For 100 years, the international community has been frantically trying to patch the software of the Middle East. We try to install a new treaty update. We delete a bad dictator program and try to download a democracy app. We send in diplomats like IT guys to clear the viruses and optimize the performance. But the author is basically screaming, stop messing with the software. The hardware itself, the motherboard, the physical map is physically cracked.
That's spot on.
It doesn't matter how elegant the software is, the system will always inevitably crash.
That analogy aligns perfectly with the devastating economic argument the text makes too. Because dealing with constantly crashing hardware isn't just frustrating, it is incredibly expensive.
Oh, yeah.
The text points out that this endless cycle of violence, suppression, and temporary ceasefires is a colossal generational money pit for these nations.
How does that play out economically on the ground? How does the map bankrupt the state?
Because the state lacks organic legitimacy, it lives in constant paranoid fear of internal fracture. Therefore, the government is forced to spend massive, wildly disproportionate amounts of its national wealth on internal security.
Right.
They have to fund massive standing armies, heavily armed gendarmeries to police the rural areas, vast intelligence networks to spy on their own citizens, and endless propaganda campaigns to justify the borders.
They are spending billions of dollars fighting insurgencies within their own borders, rather than defending against external threats.
Exactly. That is capital that is vanishing into a black hole. It is not being spent on cross-border trade. It is not being spent on modernizing the electrical grid, building high-speed rail, constructing universities, or developing human capital.
It's just wasted.
The artificial map traps these nations in a permanent cycle of poverty and militarization. They are bleeding their own economies dry just to keep the borders from moving an inch.
So the hardware is broken, the software keeps crashing, the IT bill is bankrupting the company, and the local network is a disaster.
Well put.
But if this was just a localized problem, the global superpowers might just look away. The problem is when this specific hardware crashes, it doesn't just affect the local network. It has a historical tendency to take down the entire global grid.
And this shifts the entire discussion from a tragic regional history lesson into a matter of urgent global necessity, which is exactly what the Smeeko Alley White House memo is designed to do.
This memo is fascinating because it totally shifts the tone. It moves away from the historical grievances of Sykes-Picot and steps right into the arena of hard-nosed, pragmatic, transactional geopolitics.
It really does.
It is a direct warning and a highly calculated pitch to the global interests of both the East and the West.
The author is essentially taking this deeply localized argument about Kurdish history and turning directly to the President of the United States or the leaders of the European Union and saying, you might think this isn't your problem, but this is actually destroying your domestic stability.
Right.
The memo walks the geopolitical powers through 4 critical areas where the foundational flaws of the Middle East directly impact global security.
Let's break down those 4 areas because this is how they hook the superpowers. Area number 1.
Yeah.
International security and counterterrorism.
The text argues that the structural instability and the lack of organic state legitimacy create massive, ungovernable power vacuums across the region. When a state has to spend all its energy suppressing its own people, it loses control of its periphery.
Right, they can't police everything.
And what fills a power vacuum? Extremist groups, transnational terror networks, and organized crime syndicates.
You look at the rise of ISIS, they exploited the exact fractured geographies and marginalized populations we are talking about in Iraq and Syria.
Exactly. The West spends trillions of dollars and sacrifices its own soldiers fighting global terror networks. But the text argues that as long as the artificial map continues to create these chaotic vacuums, the West is just playing endless whack-a-mole.
You are treating a symptom that the map will continually regenerate.
Right.
It's like trying to scoop water out of a sinking boat with a teacup without ever plugging the hole in the hull. Okay, impact area number 2. Energy supply and market stability.
The global economy, despite pushes for green energy, still fundamentally runs on fossil fuels, and a massive portion of that energy flows through or originates in the Middle East. When these artificial borders cause cyclical wars, or when oppressed groups attack state infrastructure, pipelines are blown up. Shipping lanes in the Persian Gulf or the Mediterranean are threatened. And when that happens, global energy markets panic.
Which means a flare-up over an artificial border drawn in 1916 directly impacts the price of a gallon of gas in Ohio or the cost of heating a home in Berlin in 2026.
Precisely. The author is telling the superpower, your domestic economy, and therefore your domestic political survival, is currently a hostage to our broken geography. As long as our map is unstable, your markets will be volatile.
That is a very persuasive argument for a politician worried about re-election. Impact area number 3 is when we see dominating headlines constantly: migration and humanitarian pressures.
The cycle of systemic oppression, economic stagnation, and outright war inevitably creates millions of displaced people. And in the hyper-connected modern world, those people don't just quietly remain in neighboring refugee camps.
No, they move.
They seek safety and opportunity by crossing seas and continents. They arrive in staggering numbers in Europe, in the UK, and in North America.
And we've seen how that massive influx of forced migration puts incredible strain on Western domestic politics. It stretches social services, it fuels reactionary populism, and it leads to massive political polarization far beyond the borders of the Middle East.
The text draws a direct causal line. A localized conflict in the Zagros Mountains, caused by a bad border, physically translates into a refugee crisis that could literally change the outcome of a national election in France or Germany or the United States.
Wow.
The map is exporting its instability directly into Western ballot boxes.
And finally, the 4th area of global impact: geopolitical proxy competition.
Because the Middle East is fundamentally broken, but still geostrategically vital, it becomes a chaotic chessboard for global superpowers. The United States, Russia, China, and regional powers like Iran and Saudi Arabia all back different artificial states or sub-state proxy groups to gain leverage.
Which creates a terrifying tripwire. Because an obscure border skirmish between 2 local militias can rapidly escalate into a global standoff involving nuclear-armed superpowers backing opposite sides.
The map forces the great powers into constant, dangerous friction. Now, after laying out all 4 of these apocalyptic global consequences, the author delivers the ultimate pitch.
This is the part of the memo that is just breathtaking in its audacity. They've laid out all the ways the current map is destroying the world economy and global security. And then they look the superpowers right in the eye and basically say, Look at your current allies in the region. Look at the governments of these 4 countries.
They're not assets.
Exactly. They are massive liabilities. They are costing you trillions of dollars. They are breeding the terrorism that attacks your cities, and they are destabilizing your energy markets. Drop them. Abandon the artificial states. Bet on us.
It is the ultimate geopolitical transaction. Help us dismantle these 4 failing states, and in return, we will give you a massive, stable, resource-rich partner that controls the crossroads of the world. We will secure the oil, we will crush the terror networks, we will stop the refugee crisis, and we will actually be an ally that shares your democratic values.
It is a brilliant pitch on paper, but logistically, realistically, how does this actually work? If you were sitting in the White House, you were thinking, okay, maybe Turkey and Iraq are difficult allies, but why in the world would the United States risk World War III to dismantle its own partners?
Right. The risks are astronomical.
Turkey controls the Bosporus Strait and hosts U.S. nuclear weapons. The U.S. has spent 2 decades building complex relationships in Iraq, and trying to violently carve up Iran and Syria would invite massive, immediate military retaliation from Russia and China. This sounds like a recipe for a global catastrophe, not global peace.
It is the most massive hurdle imaginable, and the author of the memo is not naive to this. They know that simply demanding a new map and promising good behavior isn't enough to convince a superpower to risk global war.
You need a plan.
You need a highly controlled, phased mechanism to achieve it. You have to dismantle the bomb without triggering it. And that is why the Smeiko Ali memo provides a specific, bureaucratic diplomatic roadmap to actually get there.
So the philosophy turns into policy. How do you legally and safely erase 4 countries?
The memo outlines a deliberate, multi-phase framework designed to incrementally dismantle the status quo while managing the geopolitical fallout. The first phase is the establishment of a historical and strategic review commission.
Okay, wait, I have to push back on this immediately. You have this sweeping, world-altering vision of redrawing the map, and step 1 is getting a bunch of academics in a room to write a report.
I know.
That sounds like the most classic, toothless, bureaucratic delay tactic in the history of government. When there is a massive geopolitical crisis, forming a committee of historians does not stop a war.
It sounds incredibly dry and academic, I completely agree. But in the context of international law, it is a profoundly aggressive, foundational first move.
Really? How so?
The memo isn't suggesting a book club. It is proposing a legally binding, internationally sanctioned structural audit. Right now, the governments of Turkey, Iran, Iraq, and Syria completely deny the historical narrative presented in this document.
Right. They have their own official state histories that say, this land has always been ours, the Kurds are just guests or insurgents, end of story.
Exactly. State sovereignty is the ultimate shield in international law. So this commission is about forcing an internationally recognized, objective baseline of historical facts.
I see.
If a UN-backed or superpower-backed legal commission formally concludes that the post-World War I borders were illegitimate and that they are deeply demonstrably damaging to indigenous populations, it strips the current states of their historical and legal defense.
I see where you're going. It legally delegitimizes their claim to the land.
Yes. You have to win the argument on paper before you can redraw the lines on the earth. It paves the way for international action by removing the defense of sovereign immunity. It's gathering the legal evidence for the demolition permit.
That makes perfect sense. So once you have the legal justification, what is the next step?
The next phase is inclusive regional dialogue. Now, standard diplomacy is what we call Westphalian diplomacy, named after the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, which established the concept of state sovereignty.
Okay.
In a Westphalian system, states only talk to states. The U.S. State Department talks to the government in Ankara or the government in Baghdad.
Right, it's the guys in the suits with the flags behind them shaking hands.
But this proposal fundamentally challenges that entire model. It insists that the actual cultural, linguistic, and demographic communities must be brought to the negotiating table, not just the capital cities that are actively suppressing them.
Logistically, how does that even work? You can't just bypass the sovereign government and invite a stateless mountain community to the United Nations. The host nation would instantly declare it an act of war.
It is incredibly difficult, but the text argues it is absolutely necessary. The argument is that if the state itself is illegitimate and oppressive, then state-to-state diplomacy is just 2 kidnappers negotiating over hostages.
Wow.
If you want a lasting solution, the superpowers have to use their leverage to force the host nations to allow these sub-state groups to participate directly in deciding their own structural future.
That is radical. You are effectively treating marginalized ethnic groups as equal geopolitical actors to sovereign nations on the world stage.
It is completely radical, and it leads directly into the third phase, institutional stability and governance reform. Because once you finally have everyone at the table, what do you actually build?
Right.
The proposal advocates for highly decentralized models of governance to prepare the ground for the new map.
So moving power away from a strong central capital that dominates the whole territory.
Exactly. If the goal is to create organic political legitimacy, you have to build systems where the central state no longer has the power or the need to suppress its own people. By decentralizing power, creating autonomous regions, and explicitly protecting minority rights locally, you remove the structural psychology of oppression we talked about earlier.
You diffuse the tension.
You diffuse the power so that the governance aligns with the demographic reality even before the international borders are officially erased.
So if I'm synthesizing the mechanics here, Phase 1 proves the house is fundamentally broken and secures the legal right to tear it down. Phase 2 bypasses the bad landlord and starts negotiating directly with the tenants. Phase 3 starts taking down the internal load-bearing walls by decentralizing power.
That is a perfect summary of how they plan to dismantle the structure from the inside out. But what about the external forces? How do you keep the global economy from panicking while you tear down the walls?
Right, which brings us to the final phase, strategic security and economic cooperation.
This is the absolute sweetener for the global powers. While the region is being structurally reorganized, which is the polite diplomatic phrasing for ripping the map apart, this final phase ensures that international trade routes, vital energy flows, and critical infrastructure are explicitly protected by cooperative, likely international security mechanisms.
It's basically saying to the United States and the European Union, please pardon our dust during this massive demolition project.
Exactly.
But we legally guarantee that the oil pipelines will remain secure, the cargo ships will keep moving through the straits, and your markets will not crash. It secures the economic lifelines to make this radical, unprecedented deal irresistible to the global market.
It is a highly calculated attempt to decouple the internal redrawing of the map from the external global economy, ensuring the superpowers have a financial incentive to support the process, rather than intervening to stop it out of fear.
This has been an absolutely wild, complex journey. We need to pull back from this dense policy framework for a second because we have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have. We've traveled through a century of history.
Let's just summarize the sheer scale of the deep dive we just went on. We started with a 100-year-old pencil sketch by two European diplomats, Sykes and Picot, in a closed room. We traced how that arbitrary sketch became a concrete map that trapped millions of people and generated a century of violence. And we arrived at a modern, highly detailed, bureaucratic proposition demanding the total redrawing of up to 60% of major Middle Eastern powers, dismantling them entirely, running UN referendums, and rewriting constitutions, all to secure global energy and long-term world peace.
It's a lot to take in.
So what does this all mean for you, the listener? Why did we spend the last hour talking about lines in the sand? Because it reminds us that the geopolitical structures we view as permanent fixtures, the bold black lines you see on Google Maps, or the colored shapes in an atlas, they're actually incredibly fragile.
Very fragile.
They're highly contested, they're historically very young, and they're entirely man-made.
They're not mountains, they're not rivers, they're arguments.
They are arguments that someone won a long time ago, often through force, and often at the expense of the people living there.
And this raises a profound question, and it's a final thought I want to leave you with to mull over. We've spent this entire time focused intensely on the Middle East,